A very good afternoon to all of you. So let us begin our remaining discussion on facial nerve. It was a long awaited discussion. Last week we could not conduct the class. So, okay, if my slide is not visible or if I am not audible, then please respond in the chat box, okay? So let us continue. Let's check. I hope I am audible to everybody. Okay. So now the facial nerve paralysis that we were discussing in the last class. One thing which is very important over here is you have to understand what is the meaning of upper motor neuron type of nerve palsy and lower motor neuron type of nerve paralysis. So first try to focus on this picture. What is the meaning of upper motor neuron lesion? Every nerve originates from the cortex. The nerve fibers come and then they have synaptic connection over the nucleus. From the nucleus, nerve fibers will again exit, innervate various body parts. So this is the nucleus. So nerve from the cortex up to the nucleus, that is above the nucleus, that is upper motor neuron, and the nerve which is in the nucleus and beyond is lower motor neuron. So any lesion of the nerve in this part is upper motor neuron lesion, and any lesion at the level of nucleus or beyond is lower motor neuron lesion. So clearly this is an upper motor neuron lesion and this is a lower motor neuron lesion. I hope I am clear. This is the first point. Now coming to the second point. What is the second point? This I know you have already studied in your central nervous system, in physiology, again in medicine. So what happens over here? When these fibers come down, suppose, so this is the right side, the fibers when they come down, almost 80% fibers cross over to the opposite side nuclei and remaining 20% innervate the same side nuclei. This is a typical characteristic. So upper motor neuron has a crossing over and the majority of neurons cross and innervate the opposite nuclei. Very little of them innervate the same side nuclei. Same for the left side. So what is this picture showing? If there is a lesion here, that means the left sided nucleus is obviously very happy because it is paired. 80% of it is coming from the right side, which is healthy. What about the left side? The left side majority was was about to receive from this part. So this side will be affected. So clear. Upper motor neuron lesion will cause contralateral paralysis. No doubt in that. Now there is one thing here. The facial muscles, this is a peculiarity of facial nerve. The facial muscles of the forehead have bilateral innervation, whereas the lower half of the face has unilateral innervation. That means if you consider the lower half of the face, the right side is getting supply from the left cortex, the left side is getting supply from the right cortex, but the upper part of the forehead is getting supply from both the sides, bilateral. So eventuality, what ultimately happens is, I told you if there is an upper motor neuron lesion, there will be contralateral paralysis because of crossover. So contralateral paralysis, okay, done. Within that contralateral paralysis also, since the upper half of the face has bilateral innervation, so again this is paired. So only lower half of the opposite side is affected in case of an upper motor neuron lesion. Coming to the next scenario, this is a lower motor neuron lesion. What will happen here? There is no crossover. Whatever crossover was there has happened. So if it is a right-sided lesion, there will be a right-sided facial paralysis and So it is always an ipsilateral, that means same sided. So ipsilateral facial palsy will be seen in case of lower motor neuron lesions. In lower motor neuron lesions, what happens? There is no possibility of this part getting supply from the opposite side also, because the entire pathway is gone beyond the nucleus. So this kind of a distal injury will cause ipsilateral entire half of the face to go under paralysis. So supranuclear or upper motor neuron lesions will cause paralysis of lower part of the face of the opposite side, partial paralysis of upper part of the face because of bilateral supply. Normal taste and saliva secretions, and stapedius is not paralyzed. These are the other functions, all the branches of facial nerve, if you recall, these are the functions. So what is impaired and what is not impaired, that is shown over here. What about the nuclear type? Ipsilateral same side paralysis of the entire face, that is entire half of the face, paralysis of lateral rectus, internal strabismus, all these things will be seen. Now coming to an entity of Bell's palsy. Yes, it is the most common cause of facial paralysis. Okay, most common cause. What is Bell's palsy? Bell's palsy, the main cause they say is a latent herpes virus infection which is reactivated from the cranial nerve ganglia. Commonest is herpes simplex virus type 1 and herpes zoster. You all know these kind of viral infections, once they infect your body and your body recovers, these viruses lay dormant in certain nerve ganglions. They lie dormant for years together. Sometimes due to low immunity, transient phase of immunosuppression in a person can lead to reactivation of these viruses, and that is one of the supposed cause of Bell's palsy. Remember, the commonest explanation they give for Bell's palsy is idiopathic. So there are many situations where you cannot even say why that has happened, but yes, the facial nerve shows paralysis. So this is so typical of facial nerve. And often, how did they come to the diagnosis? In some patients, from the facial nerve sections were taken and they have found out herpes virus DNA. So this is one of the cause, it is said. Inflammation of the nerve initially results in a neuropraxia, which is a reversible condition. So there is inflammation, there is neuropraxia, and at this stage, if the infection is controlled, the patient will completely recover from the Bell's palsy. Herpes zoster virus is more aggressive than herpes simplex type 1. What is Bell's phenomena? Bell's phenomena and Bell's palsy are not same. Okay, Bell's phenomena is upward diversion of the eyeball on attempted closure of the lid. So this is very typical of any patient of Bell's palsy. This is what will happen. Okay, when he'll try, you'll ask the patient to close the eyes. The affected side, the eyes will not be able to close because facial nerve paralysis has occurred. Rather, the eye will remain open and there will be upward rolling of the eyeball. This is known as Bell's phenomenon. What are the other features? It is unilateral always. Okay. Inability to smile, close eye or raise eyebrow. Obviously all facial expressions are gone. Whistling is impossible. Drooping of corner of the mouth. Inability to close the eyelid, which is Bell's sign. Wrinkling is gone on that side. Loss of blinking reflex, slurring of speech. So here which side is affected? Obviously the left side. So how will you diagnose? I told you the commonest cause of Bell's palsy is idiopathic. So basically Bell's palsy is a diagnosis of exclusion. Onset is very important. It is a sudden onset disease with paralysis of all muscle groups of one side of the face in the absence, this is very important, absence of sign of CNS, any central nervous system lesion, and absence of obvious ear disease. So there is no ear pathology, there is no CS1, there is no infection which is actually paralyzing the nerve, as in bacterial infection. There is no central nervous system lesion, but still the patient has developed a facial palsy, which is very sudden in onset. Overnight they may develop it. How do you manage a patient of Bell's palsy? eye care is very important, because you have seen that the patient, even on forceful closure, is not able to close his eyes completely. So till the facial nerve function recovers, you have to take care of the eye. Otherwise, what will happen? There will be exposure keratitis. So you have to focus on protecting the cornea from drying and of course abrasions. So lubricants and antibiotic drops should be continuously applied to avoid any eye injury till the facial nerve gains its function. Apart from that, what will you do? So remember, approach to a patient with Bell's palsy is mainly conservative. Facial nerve has undergone paralysis, cause is idiopathic. How will I treat it when I don't know the cause? So you have to take care of the functions which have now become abnormal. You have to wait for the nerve to recover. What happens? Usually in a span of 2 weeks to 1 month, the nerve starts recovering, and often these patients gain back full function of the nerve. But yes, in certain percentage of patients, nerve function does not recover. What will be done in them? We'll see it. So in the meanwhile, you have to give, this is what infrared radiation and galvanism, this is just, you can say, small electric currents are given, very small, to stimulate the muscles and bring back the function of the muscles. Okay. Facial massage is very important, and there is a general agreement. It is seen that 70 to 80% of these patients will recover completely, and the remainder also may recover within 3 months. So medical treatment is, because there is inflammation, you have to give steroids. So prednisolone 1 mg per kg per day up to 7 to 10 days, and thereafter tapering. Second is, because one suspected cause is herpes, so you have to give acyclovir 400 mg 5 times a day. Nowadays actually valacyclovir is more preferred over acyclovir for treatment of Bell's palsy. Now coming to the next thing, surgical treatment. So this is reserved for only those patients. You have a time of 3 months. You will wait for 3 months for the nerve to recover. If suppose, in spite of giving full conservative treatment, full coverage of steroids and antivirals, yet the patient is not recovering and his facial nerve function is not improving, then you have to go for a surgical technique which is known as facial nerve decompression. What is the meaning of decompression? There is inflammation and edema which is compressing the facial nerve. So you will do a surgery to release that edema and that pressure over the facial nerve. Okay. Second, so one is Bell's palsy. Coming to the second one, which is herpes zoster oticus, otherwise known as Ramsay-Hunt syndrome. Here what happens? Facial paralysis associated with ear pain is a very painful condition. Okay, it is due to herpes zoster infection. Vesicles will be formed with sensory neural hearing loss and sometimes even vertigo. What are the other causes of facial palsy apart from Bell's palsy and Ramsay-Hunt syndrome? CSOM. Otitis media is an infection in the middle ear and it can spread to the facial. Facial nerve abscess is a known complication of CSOM. Sometimes certain granulomatous diseases like neurosarcoidosis. And please remember, bilateral. Whatever we discussed, Bell's palsy, Ramsay-Hunt syndrome, these are all unilateral, right? Even CSOM facial palsy is unilateral usually. Bilateral facial paralysis should hint towards some systemic condition like sarcoidosis. Okay. Mobius syndrome, these are all congenital facial palsy. Treacher-Collins syndrome. So these are certain craniofacial anomalies. Some children are born with congenital craniofacial anomalies, and in them this kind of facial palsy from birth is seen. Okay, and golden horse syndrome. All these diseases belong to a common spectrum of craniofacial disorders. Then coming to traumatic causes. This is also a very common cause. Okay, any kind of temporal bone fracture, road traffic accidents, iatrogenic during surgery if there is an injury to the facial nerve, penetrating middle ear injury or barotrauma. All these traumatic conditions can cause facial palsy. Certain endocrine causes like diabetes, pregnancy, hyperthyroidism, infectious causes. Apart from herpes, other causes can be malignant otitis externa, What is the organism causing malignant otitis externa? Yes, anybody? Reply me in chat. I'm waiting. What is the causative organism of malignant otitis externa? There's no point in googling. Google करके बता रहे हो. What is the possible cause? Pseudomonas is a very known cause of malignant otitis externa, and this is a kind of infection which begins with the external ear but ends up involving the skull base. Okay. Then chronic otitis media, Gradenigo's syndrome, mastoiditis, all these are the infectious causes. HIV. Okay, so this is just to show you why we need to do sometimes facial nerve decompression. Look at this, a huge tumor compressing on the facial nerve. So facial nerve is actually fine, there is no disease in the facial nerve, only the tumor is pressing it and the patient has developed facial paralysis. Okay, sometimes congenital causes, idiopathic, iatrogenic, I told you. So this is a very popular picture. I hope many of you have seen this movie. So the facial expression of this is exactly what you'll get if you get a type of, the nerve supplies are involved. So this more or less summarizes your facial nerve disorders. Now we have another system to discuss. Okay, I'll go very briefly with this. Just to orient you about vestibular system, this will almost cover the ear part. In vestibular system, one is hearing, that is cochlea, one is balance, which is all about the vestibular system. So you can very easily see 3 semicircular canals. So the entire vestibular system or the balance has 2 parts, peripheral and central. Peripheral comprises of this membranous labyrinth, which is formed by semicircular ducts, utricle, saccule and the vestibular nerve, and central is at the central level, that is cerebellum. So we know there are 3 semicircular canals. How do they actually help in balance of our body? What is their role? These 3 canals lie at right angle to each other, and the one which lies right angle to the axis of rotation is stimulated the most. Whether you are walking, you are lying horizontal on the bed, you are jumping, you are moving in circles, whatever is your axis of rotation, the semicircular canal which is perpendicular to that axis, that gets stimulated the most. It detects there is a movement in this axis and it will produce counterproductive movement within that labyrinth and it will balance you. So, main function of vestibular system, it provides information concerning gravity, rotation and acceleration. Serves as a reference for somatosensory and visual systems. Contributes to integration of, so basically it is integrating all other functions, higher functions, and finally your balance. So, disorders of the vestibular system also accordingly are divided into 2 parts, peripheral and central. So in short, what all this means? It means any patient with a balance disorder, you have to think of 2 things. The cause can be in the peripheral vestibular system or the peripheral system of balance or the central system of balance. That's it. So you have to find out what is the cause of imbalance in this patient. Peripheral cause of imbalance, which will involve obviously the semicircular canals and the vestibular nerve. Common diseases like Meniere's disease, BPPV, benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, labyrinthitis, all these are causes of imbalance and they are peripheral causes, whereas central causes which are more dangerous, okay, like vestibulo-ocular, vestibulospinal, all other pathways are affected. Common causes of central imbalances: vertebrovascular insufficiency, basilar migraine, and cerebellum. Yes, we all know cerebellum maintains balance of the body, and multiple sclerosis. All these are causes of central cause of imbalance. So when we assessment of vestibular function also primarily focuses on this aspect, that what is the cause of this? What is the commonest presentation of a patient with dizziness? A patient usually of a peripheral vestibular system lesion will present with a sense of giddiness in his head, or you can say vertigo. So vertigo is the sense of spinning sensation, and this vertigo, if you have to ask the patient very clearly, what is it that you exactly are feeling? Whether you are feeling that your head, you're turning, you're rotating constantly, and the environment is static, you are rotating. Is that what you are feeling, or you're just feeling a bit dizzy? A person who is a bit dizzy, like suppose you have skipped your breakfast, you have not eaten your breakfast, now by 2 p.m. you will feel dizzy. So that is a sense of giddiness, hypoglycemia, but that is not vertigo. Vertigo is when, even when the patient is sitting at rest and everything around him is spinning. Get my point? That is true vertigo. That's the first thing you have to ask the patient, whether he is having true vertigo or not. And second, you have to see whether it is only vertigo or there is imbalance. What is the difference? Again, imbalance is unsteadiness of gait. He cannot walk properly, he'll fall down. This is more commonly seen in cerebellum lesions in the cerebellum. Coming down to the tests, clinically there is nystagmus, fistula test, Romberg's test. These are very important. Okay, gait and test of cerebellar function, and then there are certain lab tests. So let us discuss one by one. Okay, let us first discuss the clinical test. How do you check for nystagmus? What is nystagmus? Rhythmic involuntary oscillatory movement of the eyeball. So it is in a rhythm and it is involuntary. The patient cannot control it. And oscillatory to and fro movement of the eyeball. It's very fast movement. Okay. How will you elicit that? The examiner should keep a finger 30 centimeter from the patient's eye. And in all the directions you have to go, right, left, up, down. And when the patient tries to move his eyeball, if the patient has nystagmus, you can see this nystagmus. But while doing nystagmus test, please remember, ask the patient not to focus very sharply on your finger. When you whenever the patient tries to fix his gaze, in mild nystagmus, the nystagmus will go. So always ask the patient to look at a far distance, as if he is looking towards infinity. Okay, and then ask him to move his eyeball. You are showing your finger only to show him the direction, but don't ask him that you should not fix your vision at my fingertip. That is also very important. Now, second is fistula test. The basis of this test is to induce nystagmus by producing pressure changes in external canal. And if in a normal person, even if we change the pressure in external auditory canal, the patient will not experience nystagmus or vertigo. But any patient who has a fistula in the bony labyrinth, what will happen? This pressure change will be transmitted to the bony labyrinth and the patient will complain of vertigo. So this is a simple test to see whether there is any fistula. What is fistula? An opening in the bony labyrinth. Romberg's test. Here the patient is asked to stand with feet together, arms by the side, with eyes first open and then closed. I am sure you all know how to do a Romberg's test. Basically, what is the balance apparatus of our body? Our balance apparatus comprises of three things. Correct? One is visual, one is vestibular system, and third is proprioception. All the three things together contribute to balance. So the balance apparatus of our body is determined by three things. What did I tell? Visual, vestibular apparatus and proprioception. In Romberg's test, what you are doing, you are asking the patient to stand with feet together and arms by the side. So patient is not standing in a wide gait, is standing with a very narrow gait, and then his eyes are first open, then you ask him to close his eyes. So you are cutting out the visual input. Next, you will ask the patient to stand on one feet alternately, once on the right, once on the left, again on the right. So then his sense of proprioception is going. So this is a sharpened Romberg's test, where even you will ask him to cross his arms folded across his chest. So his total proprioception balance is going, and any person now with a vestibular lesion cannot maintain his balance, because rest too you have subtracted. The only thing remaining is vestibular system. A person with a healthy vestibular system can still balance himself, but one who has a defective balance system cannot. This is the very concept of Romberg's disease. That is the reason, a patient with balance disorders, they prefer not to walk in the dark. They do not like to walk in the dark. Why? Because suppose dark means I am saying pitch dark. They would not like to walk in that environment. Suppose there is a sudden power shortage and there is pitch darkness, they would prefer to sit, because their sense of balance is hampered. This is often an early sign of patients who are developing balance disorder. Okay. Then gait. So gait, I told you, gait disorder is more commonly seen in cerebellar lesions. What are the tests of cerebellar dysfunction? This also should be done when you are assessing a patient's vestibular system. Okay. Abnormal finger nose test, dysmetria, inability to control range of motion, dysdiadochokinesia. So rapid alternating movements of pronation and supination of the palm, and rebound phenomenon. So all these has to be included in the spectrum of cerebral balance disorder. Then lab test. So all this was clinical. Now let us discuss certain lab tests. Okay, so I'm just going back to that slide. So lab tests are first calorie tests, then ENG and all the other tests. So I will not discuss in detail about all the tests, but I'll just tell you few important points. So calorie tests are highly sensitive for unilateral lesion, because we are stimulating each ear separately and we are inducing nystagmus. The concept is, if you change the temperature of the air or water, whatever is entering into the air, into the ears, and you change the temperature, that stimulates nystagmus. So that is the concept of calorie test, which can be done by bithermal calorie test, cold air calorie test and modified Coprax. So this, I have just deliberately put this picture. This is to show you how patients with vestibular diseases are given exercises. These are various vestibular rehabilitation exercise of looking up and down, left and right, convergence exercise of the eyeball, head movements, bending movements. Okay, these are the various exercises that these patients are advised who have vestibular lesion. What is the concept of these exercises? Only one. What? These patients have the most important stimulus of vertigo in these patients is movement, and you are causing movement and actually acclimatizing the patient to movement. Initially he may have some complaint, gradually with these exercises they get used and the vestibular system becomes stronger after doing these exercises, because now they can handle changes in motion better. Okay. Just in brief about vestibular disorder. The first is dizziness. So diseases of the vestibular system can take different forms, and vertigo is the most prominent symptom, often accompanied by nausea. So disorders of vestibular system again divided into peripheral cause and central cause, which is, we have done this. I have already told you 85% cases are peripheral in nature. Peripheral, remember, good prognosis. Once it's a central cause, it becomes very difficult to treat. And central lesion means something sinister, something is there in the brain, maybe a tumor, maybe a space occupying lesion which is causing these symptoms. So central disorders causing, again this is just a repetition, so various conditions like multiple sclerosis and bacillar migraine, these conditions can cause disorders. Now vestibular disorders, this is more important for ENT perspective. BPPV, please remember, is the most common cause of peripheral vertigo. Okay, second is Meniere's disease. Then you have vestibular neuronitis and labyrinthitis. Again, of course, ototoxic drugs. So BPPV patient, he'll say that I feel like the room is spinning when I turn my head. So this is a true vertigo. It's a self-limiting condition characterized by episodic vertigo and nystagmus of few seconds. It lasts for few seconds, okay? Maximum minutes, 4 to 5 minutes. And it is, remember, positional in nature. What is the name? B, it's benign. Paroxysmal, it comes in episodes. Positional, so it is positional in nature. That means the patient gets this vertigo only in certain positions, not always. So it is positional in nature, and it is the most common peripheral vestibular disorder. Please remember this one word. It is disorder mainly of posterior semicircular canal. The otoconial debris keeps it where it should be. It comes out from there. It floats all around. Okay, and it then settles on the cupula of posterior semicircular canal and causes vertigo. So this is the main pathophysiology of BPPV. And whenever you take history, you have to take the history of BPPV patients where they have a short episode of true vertigo and often accompanied by nausea, but yes, they have no complaint of hearing loss or tinnitus. You have to do a Dix-Hallpike maneuver. This is a test done to detect BPPV. The details of it you'll get in the book. Please just remember, we ask the patient to turn the head, we bring the head to a certain position and then the patient lies down. You induce nystagmus in these kind of patients, and if you see nystagmus, which is a jerky movement of the eyeball, then you can come to the conclusion that this may be a case of BPPV, okay? And if you see that the patient is suffering from BPPV, you have to immediately correct it on table. Physiotherapy, no medicines. You have to immediately correct it. There are certain maneuvers. For your purpose, you just remember the name of this maneuver, Epley's maneuver, okay? The test is known as the Dix-Hallpike test. If you see that the patient does not develop nystagmus, that means he is not suffering from BPPV. Fine, the patient can go home. If the patient is having nystagmus, thereby you have diagnosed it as BPPV, you will, same sitting, you will do Epley's maneuver and then the patient will go home, okay? This is the best treatment of Epley's maneuver. So now, whenever the patient you have done an Epley's maneuver, you have to remember that because you have induced nystagmus, no? So you have to explain the patient that wait for 30 minutes, sit down, don't immediately drive your car, wait for some time because he may get an attack of vertigo. And gradually after few episodes of correction and therapy, the patient recovers very well. Okay, now coming to the second cause of vertigo, which is Meniere's disease, endolymphatic hydrops. So this is a special, there is a different chapter for Meniere's disease because it is common, and here the patient presents not only with vertigo but also with hearing loss and tinnitus, correct? So here it is endolymphatic cochlea. The fluid within the cochlea is increasing. Endolymph is now bulging because of excess of fluid. So distension of the endolymphatic system can be due to either increased production of endolymph or defective absorption. There is only two ways by which the secretion increases, which ultimately leads to distension of membranous labyrinth and rupture of Reissner's membrane. Okay, and then mixing of endolymph with perilymph. That stimulates vertigo. So clinical feature, please, this is very important. Vertigo here will last from minutes to hours. In BPPV it lasts for seconds to minutes. So it lasts for as long as 2 to 3 hours. So just imagine. It's a very distressing condition. Accompanied by nausea and vomiting, ataxia, nystagmus, everything. Hearing loss is fluctuating in nature. and tinnitus. So on examine, these are all, this is actually I'm trying to cover Meniere's also with this. So tympanic membrane is absolutely normal, you won't see anything. Nystagmus also only during attacks, but one thing which you can see is the tuning fork test you do, you get a sensory neural hearing loss. Okay, and then you have to come, if the patient is developing episodes of vertigo like this and complaining of tinnitus and hearing loss also, then you have to come to a diagnosis of Meniere's, and you have to confirm it by doing audiometry. So this is how in early stages there is a low frequency hearing in this, the right ear is normal, in the left ear you can see the bone conduction is also dipping along with air conduction. In the low frequencies the dip is more, which indicates an early stage of Meniere's, and gradually as it progresses higher frequencies are affected. Okay, how will you diagnose this Meniere's disease? Glycerol test is used for diagnosing Meniere's patient, and the calorie test, glycerol test, calorie test, ENG, all these spectrum of tests you can do, and this is important. Nowadays we do CT scan also. You can see the location of endolymphatic sac, and MRI is done only when you are ruling out any tumor like acoustic neuroma. Okay, then you need to do MRI scan. See, I am just brushing through the main points. So how will you treat a patient? This is just like a patient of, because it is also endolymphatic hydrops, there is increase in pressure of within the endolymphatic chamber. So just a patient of hypertension like that you have to treat here. Dietary restriction of salt, caffeine, cessation of smoking, diuretics you have to give, vasodilators, and next group is labyrinthine sedatives. Any kind of vertigo patients are given labyrinthine sedatives for a short period of time to reduce their symptoms. Okay, now so apart from, in Meniere's, we are still discussing Meniere's. In Meniere's disease, apart from salt restriction, diuretic therapy, some may be given hyperosmolar dehydration technique and giving vestibular sedatives. Sometimes you may need to do something known as intratympanic ablation. That is, you have to, some patients get intractable vertigo and they have a high SN hearing loss. So already they are deaf and they are getting vertigo which is making them restless. They cannot carry out any activity because it will last for days together. Then these patients who have already no hearing, you can go for intratympanic gentamicin. Basically this is like deliberately you are destroying the cochlea. The cochlear cells will be destroyed, so no endolymph collection, no symptoms. Okay, this is a very drastic treatment modality only for end stage patients who are not responding to any other surgery. Okay, and the surgical procedure that is done is endolymphatic sac decompression. Okay, endolymphatic sac will be decompressed, a shunt will be created and fluid will come out. So this is the proper surgery that is being done. So here advantage is better hearing and vertigo is also relieved. Whereas in intratympanic injection, your whatever hearing is there, it will all go because you are damaging the cochlea, right? So this is okay. Now third, so first we discussed BPPV, second we discussed Meniere's, third we are discussing vestibular neuritis. This is also a very common cause of vertigo. It's a sudden onset peripheral vertigo. Okay, and usually again without hearing loss. So BPPV has no hearing loss, vestibular neuritis has no hearing loss. Meniere's typically has hearing loss. So this is how these things have to be kept in mind when you are evaluating a patient of vertigo. So it will last for several hours, even sometimes days together. Here inflammation of vestibular nerve, this is neuritis, so itis is there is inflammation of the vestibular nerve, and it comes on its own, it will go on its own. So only thing is you have to give symptomatic and supportive treatment in case of vestibular neuritis. Migraine, very important, especially basilar migraine, and even normal migraine patients may complain of disequilibrium and vertigo. headache will increase the episodes of vertigo. So vertigo is often seen in patients with migraine. And this is just to tell you the difference between neuritis and labyrinthitis. So labyrinthitis is another cause of peripheral vertigo. So whatever we were discussing in detail were all causes of peripheral vertigo. Any patient, even for vestibular labyrinthitis or neuritis, they will spontaneously recover after a period of days to weeks. So whatever medications we give it with the aim to control the dizziness, episodes of nausea, vomiting, and to rehabilitate the patient till the vestibular function of the opposite side recovers. And what happens in vestibule, if one side semicircular canals are damaged, the opposite side will take up the function of this side, and there will be a compensatory mechanism. That is how dizziness will subside within a few weeks. But for that time being, you have to give supportive treatment to the patient. In this is for patients of neuritis or labyrinthitis, okay? But for Meniere's, you have to treat the cause. For BPPV, you have to go for vestibular rehabilitation exercises. Now, vestibular rehabilitation, it may be performed by an audiologist or a physiotherapist. So I have to show you the exercise. You remember I shown you that page, that bending, head movement, neck movement, rotation, all these are exercises. These exercises help in compensation of the brain after a vestibular injury and makes the patient feel better. So they help the patient in increasing inputs to the visual, vestibular and somatosensory systems. Migraine associated dizziness I just told you. So migraine with severe headache, vertigo and pressure symptoms sometimes may be confused with Meniere's disease. But typical of migraine is there is a sense of aura along with that, sound or light, aura is there. And other less common but important otologic conditions, peripheral vertigo is superior semicircular canal dehiscence, perilymph fistula and vestibular schwannoma. Okay, so these you just remember the names, that is enough. But in detail you have to know about BPPV, Meniere's, labyrinthitis. Okay, because you can get short notes on them. And two important things. One is Tullio's effect, sound induced vertigo or nystagmus. Any patient of fistula, this patient, okay, semicircular canal dehiscence, they have a fistula. So loud sound can stimulate vertigo in them. This is known as Tullio's effect. Similarly, you have Henneberg's phenomena where pressure induced vertigo is seen. So this is to summarize. We will just summarize how to know whether the vertigo is a vestibular weakness, that is, it is a peripheral or a central. So history will tell you, nystagmus, all the clinical tests will tell you, and then certain lab tests. And within lab test, calorie test we have discussed. Other tests are ENG, just like you have ECG for heart, you have ENG for vestibular system, electronystagmography. Then you have WEMP, these are the latest ones, and electrocochleography. For these I think you just read them, understand, and at least remember the names. Vestibular complaints are very common to ENT. Thorough evaluation and understanding is important. Why did I spend? Actually, I spent one whole class on vestibular lesions. Just because tomorrow when you will be clinicians, one thing should be set in your mind. See, not every time you are studying for exams alone, right? Even if you are examining 50 patients of vertigo and you may see 49 of them may be peripheral, but even one cause of central vertigo you should not miss. Because if a patient of central vertigo is being seen, you have to immediately refer the patient to neurosurgeons or neurologist, because central cause of vertigo means either there is a space occupying lesion of a tumor or vertebral basilar insufficiency, so that is a very dangerous, or sometimes cerebellar stroke. Patients who have undergone stroke in the cerebellum, they may also present with intractable vertigo and nystagmus. So that is very important for you to realize how to differentiate between peripheral vertigo and central vertigo. It is not that any vertigo patient will come and will give a vestibular suppressant. No. You have to always evaluate the patient, come to a conclusion of provisional diagnosis, only then you will give a vestibular suppressant. Okay. So that is all. That concludes today's class, and next class I'll cover something from rhinology. Okay, otology is almost covered, and I'll see if I can have one or two class on laryngology. Okay, so okay, have a good day. Let's stop our discussion over here. Okay, any doubts, anybody? Previous classes, any doubt? See, I try to keep my class duration short so that I can discuss few things. Nothing? You guys are studying? You'll be having exams. Don't worry. Don't think that all exams are postponed indefinitely. No. So no questions from anybody? How many of you are there today? 23. Okay. Okay then. Let us. Okay.